Welcome, gentle traveler. Tonight, I invite you to walk softly through a village that once thrived beneath lantern-lit skies before it quietly vanished into memory. Let the warmth of flickering lights, whispered stories, and tender moments carry you slowly into the calm embrace of night. This is the village that vanished after the Feast of Lanterns. You remember the scent, first sweet beeswax and night jasmine, blending softly with the faintest hint of wood smoke that curled from hearths even in the gentle warmth of August. The village of Morose Hollow was never truly cold in summer, but the people there believed every good night deserved the comfort of a little fire. And so, as the Feast of Lanterns drew near each year, you'd see the cottages glowing earlier and earlier, as if the village itself were preparing to be cradled by something older than memory, older than celebration, older even than stories told by grandmothers in rocking chairs beside the fire. The path into the hollow was not marked on any map, but if you followed the low stream that babbled through the birch trees and listened for the wind chimes that were always left swaying in the branches, you'd eventually find yourself standing before the arched wooden bridge. It groaned a little underfoot, not from disrepair, but as though it remembered every footstep that had crossed it and was reluctant to let them go. The lanterns would already be hanging from the trees by then, small, delicate things made of oiled paper and thin twine, each one painted with soft brush strokes of birds, flowers, and stars. They fluttered in the breeze like sleepy butterflies, swaying ever so slightly, as if nodding to welcome you back. You always arrived at twilight, when the sky melted into the dusky lavender that seemed to belong only to this place. The light had a way of stretching longer over the fields here, as though reluctant to leave the meadows and the little footpaths that wound between gardens and stone fences. The air carried that kind of golden warmth that clings to your sleeves and hair and makes even the shadows feel kind. Everything was touched with a sort of waiting, like the village was holding its breath for something gentle and beautiful to begin. The Feast of Lanterns was never loud. It unfolded like a lullaby, slow and certain, as if the entire village had agreed that peace itself was the guest of honor. Tables were laid beneath the wide-limbed oaks, their surfaces covered in soft linen and simple garlands of wildflowers strung by hand. The dishes were humble, but made with such care-honeyed root vegetables, bread still warm from the oven, soft cheese wrapped in herbs, and bowls of blackberries that stained your fingers and tongue with their inky sweetness. There was always a pot of elderflower cordial kept cool in the spring-fed well, and you remember how the clay cup would bead with droplets as you held it, its smooth rim cool against your lips. No one ever spoke above a hush. Conversations rustled like the breeze through the tall grasses. Laughter, when it came, was the kind that felt like a shared secret, low, warm, and brief. Children would lie in the grass with fireflies dancing just above their heads, and the elders would light the first of the floating lanterns, setting them gently adrift in the shallow pool at the edge of the woods. They didn't float far, just circled slowly, casting golden ripples that shimmered across the water's surface like whispers. You were never quite sure who started the songs. One voice would rise like a thread, delicate and clear, and others would join in softly, weaving a tapestry of sound that felt stitched together with candlelight and sleep. They sang old tunes, melodies without names, words half lost to time, verses that spoke of harvest moons and rivers that remembered footsteps long after they were gone. You never knew the lyrics fully, but your mouth moved with them just the same, carried by rhythm and memory, and something deeper than understanding. The lanterns, those delicate, glowing vessels, were never the same 2 years in a row. Some years they were shaped like birds with feathered wings outspread, their thin paper bodies swaying in the breeze. Other years they resembled stars, or blossoms, or creatures from the villagers' dreams. No one claimed to make them, yet they appeared each year, tied carefully to branches, lining windowsills, perched atop garden gates. They glowed with a color that wasn't quite orange, not quite gold, something in between, like the warm press of a hand on your back just before you fall asleep. You remember wandering down the little path behind the bakery, where the cobblestones grew moss between them, and the scent of rising dough curled out into the dusk like a promise. There was a bench there, carved from an old apple tree, smooth and sun-warmed. You'd sit with a small bowl of plum compote, watching as lanterns blinked into being, one by one, each light, a gentle heartbeat pulsing in the darkness. People passed by in pairs, in trios, alone and unhurried, the hem of their garments brushing softly against the earth, their shadows long and graceful. Sometimes you'd catch glimpses, just the faintest impression of faces in the candlelight that you didn't quite recognize, though they felt familiar. A woman with silver hair and no footprints behind her, a child holding a lantern that didn't flicker in the wind, a man with eyes like still water who nodded once and said nothing at all. They never lingered, just moved through the feast, like the scent of lavender carried on a breeze here, then gone, leaving only the feeling of them behind. The feast never ended with fanfare. It simply quieted, like a tide retreating. One by one, the villagers would carry their lanterns back to their homes, their paths aglow with the soft hush of farewell. The tables would remain, their cloths fluttering gently, and the pool would hold its golden reflections a little longer, as if reluctant to let go. You'd walk slowly back across the arched bridge, lantern in hand, the night wrapped around your shoulders like a borrowed cloak, and somewhere behind you, the village would exhale, settling back into its gentle slumber. It was always like that, until the last year. But that part hasn't come yet. For now you hold the memory of warmth, of golden light and elderflower sweetness, of songs half remembered and faces almost known. You hold the hush of twilight and the way the lanterns seemed to float, not just through the air, but through time itself. You hold Merrow's Hollow as it was in those soft, golden evenings when the village was still there, waiting, and you still believed it always would be. There was a house at the edge of the village that always smelled faintly of turpentine and lavender oil. Even when the doors were closed and the windows shuttered against the night, it leaned slightly to one side, not from neglect, but in that way old things sometimes do, as if bowing ever so gently toward the earth it had stood upon for generations. The shutters were painted the pale blue of early morning frost, and the garden outside grew wild with white hollyhocks, soft marjoram, and climbing sweet pea that curled around the fence posts like slow-moving ribbons. You remember the crunch of gravel underfoot as you walked the little path to the front door, and how the wooden gate gave a polite creak, not as protest but as greeting, a sound that seemed woven into the rhythm of the place. Inside, it was always warm, not from fire necessarily, though sometimes a low coal bed flickered behind the grate butt from color. The walls were washed in gentle hues, sun-worn and soft-edged, like memory itself. Paintings lined every surface leaning against the baseboards, hanging in crooked rows, tucked onto narrow ledges between drying bundles of herbs. The house smelled like earth and oils and old paper, with something sweet always rising faintly from the kitchen, even if nothing had been baked that day. It was a scent like memory steeped in honey, like time preserved in glass. The woman who lived there had hands stained with pigment, the fine crescent of cobalt blue always caught beneath her nails, and the faint ghost of gold dusted into the lines of her knuckles. Her voice was low, like wind sliding through the tall grasses in the hollow's eastern fields, and her laugh when it came was rare and melodic, as if plucked from the strings of an unseen instrument. You never knew her name, not truly. Everyone called her the Sky Painter, though you always thought that title sounded too large and too small all at once. She had a way of watching the clouds that made you feel she knew their names. Too not just the types, but the actual names they had whispered to her on quiet afternoons when no one else was listening. She painted the sky, yes, but not only the sky as it appeared. She painted skies as they might be, as they remembered themselves, as they had once been seen by someone long gone but not quite forgotten. Her work did not try to mimic the heavens above, but rather evoked the hush before dawn, the aching glow of twilight, the velvet hush of night when the stars feel nearer than your own breath. In her skies there were birds that flew not in flocks but in spirals, and constellations that shimmered with stories you felt you should know. Even if you'd never heard them spoken aloud, you remember sitting with her once, long after the sun had slipped below the fields and the lanterns outside had begun to blink into life. She offered you tea, though the cup was chipped, and the tea itself tasted like rosemary and something unfamiliar, something almost citrus, but softer, like the idea of fruit rather than the fruit itself. Her table was cluttered, not in a careless way, but like a place where living had been done well. Brushes rested in cloudy jars of water. Thin cloths, stained with every shade imaginable, were draped like flags over the backs of chairs, and an open window let in the scent of the night-blooming jasmine that climbed the trellis outside. You asked her, timidly, how she knew what to paint. She didn't answer for a while, just stirred her tea in slow circles, watching the steam rise as if reading the shapes it made. And then, softly, she said she didn't decide what to paint. The skies came to her, each one tied to a person, a moment, a whisper caught in the folds of time. She said the village gave them to her, not out loud, but in the way the light pooled at the corners of windows, or the way laughter echoed down the lane in the early evening, or in the sudden silence that sometimes fell when a thought was too deep for words. I just listen, she said. And when I've listened long enough, I paint. You didn't understand then, not fully, but you remember how that house felt as you left it, how the night air seemed gentler, how the stars blinked with what felt like intention, and how your own shadow seemed less like a shape and more like a companion. You carried a small painting with you that night, a gift she insisted you take. It was only the size of your palm, and it showed a sky that didn't look like anything you'd seen before, pale green fading into silver, with a single streak of rust-red cloud winding through like a memory threading a dream. She told you it was the sky of someone's last dance beneath the lanterns, long ago. She didn't say who. You never asked. The painting stayed with you for years, tucked safely in a drawer, lined with lavender sachets and folded linen. You'd take it out sometimes on winter nights when the wind howled louder than you remembered, and you'd stare into it until the house felt warm again. There was something in that sky that made you feel both very young and very old at once, as if you were remembering something that hadn't happened yet. And when the village vanished, when you returned, and found only the echo of where Merrow's Hollow had been, you found the painting again. It was untouched, unchanged, the pigment as bright as the day it had been given. You stared at it for a long time, tracing the swirl of color with your finger, and for a moment you thought you smelled lavender oil and turpentine. You thought you heard the brush of canvas, the rustle of hollyhocks in the wind, the quiet clink of a chipped teacup being set gently on a wooden table. You still don't know what happened to the village, but you keep that painting near your bed now, and every so often, just before sleep takes you, you see that strange sky behind your closed eyelids. And sometimes, if the night is quiet enough, you feel the hush of color settling across your thoughts, like pigment soaking into paper, like clouds finding their shape again. And then you dream of lanterns. You remember the mornings most vividly, not the bright, brash kind that come with bustling birdsong and sunshine tumbling too eagerly through the window, but the hushed kind where the air feels steeped in softness and everything carries the warmth of something not yet spoken. The cobbled lane that curved gently past the fountain and toward the village square would still be cool with dawn's breath, and the mist would cling to your ankles like a sleepy cat, reluctant to let go. It was in that quiet hour that you would first smell the bread, the scent curling from the small brick bakery, like a promise, warm and floury and thick with butter and thyme. The baker's name, if he ever had one that was used aloud, had been lost to familiarity, and so everyone called him simply Old Rye, not out of rudeness, but out of the deep affection that made names unnecessary. He was round in the way flour settles in soft heaps, and slow in his movements, as though each gesture had been measured to carry just the right amount of care. His clothes were always dusted in a pale fog of flour, and his hands, large, lined, and gentle, moved with the rhythm of someone who had spent his life learning the language of dough. You remember the bakery door creaking open under your hand, how the iron latch always clicked twice before it gave way, as if testing your intent. Inside, the warmth wrapped itself around you like an old quilt, and the scent of rising yeast and sugar would sink into your clothes and hair, as though the room itself was exhaling. Baskets lined the wooden shelves, long, oval ones for braided loaves, deep round ones for nut-studded hearth bread, tiny woven trays that cradled soft rolls brushed with milk and dusted with cinnamon. Each loaf was marked with a gentle scoring nothing, flashy, just a single line, a leaf, a swirl, as if each one carried a secret known only to the hands that shaped it. There was something different about the bread in Merrow's Hollow. It wasn't just the ingredients, though the butter did come from cows that grazed in sun-dappled pastures, and the honey from bees who slept in lavender hives, and the water from the well that ran clear and deep beneath the hills. It was something more quiet, more secret. They said Old Rye could feel what a person needed, and he kneaded that need into the dough itself. A mother grieving her daughter's silence might find her bread warm with rosemary and the memory of lullabies. A lonely child might bite into a sweet bun that reminded her of a festival she couldn't remember attending. A tired soul who hadn't laughed in years might find the crust of his rye bread crackled with the sound of something just about to begin again. You never saw him write down a recipe. There were no books in the bakery, no measuring cups or timers, only a handful of clay jars. each filled with something powdered or golden or fragrant, and a deep wooden trough where he worked the dough with quiet reverence. You watched once, hidden behind the tall shelf of fruit preserves, as he laid his hands upon the mound of flour and water and salt, like someone whispering a secret into the earth. He never rushed. His fingers pressed and folded, lifted and turned, the dough growing more alive beneath them, more certain, more filled with something unnamed. He didn't speak often, and when he did, it was more to the dough than to you. But on rare mornings, when the world seemed particularly still and the air carried that silver hush that comes just before rain, he would hum a tune so old it felt like it came from the stones in the wall. A low, sweet sound, slow and cyclical, like a lullaby sung not to a child, but to time itself. You never knew where the song began or ended. It simply wove itself into the air like steam rising from a cup of tea, gone before you could quite catch it. During the Feast of Lanterns, the bakery glowed longer than any other place in the village. Long after the last lantern had been tied to the eaves, long after the hush of song had drifted across the fields and into the woods, old Rye would still be working, the orange warmth of his hearth casting a soft halo through the misted window panes. He baked a special bread only for that night around. Golden loaf with a ribbon of something dark and sweet hidden within. No one knew what the ribbon was. Some guessed plum, others said dates, and some swore it was made from petals that only bloomed once a year beneath the full moon. But everyone agreed that the bread made you remember something tender, something quiet, something you had not known you'd forgotten. You took one of those loaves home once, wrapped in parchment and still warm through the cloth. You held it against your chest as you walked, as though it might anchor the memory of the evening, the candlelight, the murmured songs, the way the night had folded itself around you like soft velvet. When you sliced into it hours later, the scent that rose was not of spice or fruit or grain, but of your grandmother's shawl, the one she wrapped you in on the winter nights when stories outlasted the fire. You didn't cry, but you held the slice in your hands for a very long time before taking the first bite. Years later, after the feast had come and gone for the final time, you returned to the lane, seeking the bakery. The foundation stones were still there, barely visible beneath the tall grass, and a scattering of tiny white flowers had grown in the outline of the old brick walls. You pressed your hand to the earth where the oven once stood, and for a moment you imagined you felt a low warmth, like embers long buried but not forgotten. A breeze stirred through the wild fennel, and for just a breath the air smelled like flower and honey and old songs. You closed your eyes then, and you could almost hear the gentle hum again, could almost see the great flower-dusted hands shaping something small and beautiful out of silence and time. And you realized, as you stood there in the hush of the forgotten village, that the bread he made wasn't just for eating, it was for remembering. And you still did. You would have walked past it a dozen times without ever thinking much of it, just a small moss-covered bell tower rising modestly behind the old tailor's shop, half hidden by a stand of whispering linden trees whose pale green leaves always seemed to quiver, even on still afternoons. It wasn't grand or imposing, not the kind of structure that demanded notice or begged to be remembered. The stone was warm to the touch in summer and cool as river water in the morning, its surface etched with age, speckled with lichen, and softened by the passage of countless quiet seasons. And yet, somehow, it was always there, like a breath in the background, like the soft thrum of something waiting. There was a bell in that tower, of coarse old bronze, cast in a forgotten forge, and lifted into its resting place, long before your time. You never heard it ring. No one had. Not during storms, not during weddings, not even during the Feast of Lanterns. When music drifted through the village like fog, and every other sound seemed to shimmer a little brighter. The villagers didn't speak about it much. When they did, they'd only say, gently and without worry, "It rings when it's needed," and leave it at that. As though the mystery was not a puzzle to be solved, but a truth to be kept softly folded like linen in a cedar chest. You remember the first time you climbed the narrow path that wound around the back of the tower, the one paved with uneven stones and littered with fallen linden leaves that clung lightly to your boots. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and morning dew, with just a touch of old iron, as though the bell itself breathed out into the trees. It was quiet there, not silent, never silent, but filled with the soft, contented hum of insects in the tall grass and the rustle of leaves brushing against one another like pages in a book. The light came dappled and gold, as if it had been filtered through memory itself, warm against your shoulders and soft on your cheeks. The tower's wooden door was never locked. Its hinges creaked in a way that didn't startle, but rather seemed to announce your arrival with the same gentleness as a friend calling your name across a garden. Inside, the scent changed, the crispness of old wood mingling with the dry sweetness of hay and something older still, like dust clinging to a story that had not yet been told. A ladder climbed the wall in steady rungs, each one worn smooth by generations of careful hands, and as you ascended, you felt the air grow stiller, quieter, as though you were stepping upward through layers of time. When you reached the top, the room beneath the bell was simpler round space, open to the sky on all four sides, with wooden beams arched above like the ribs of a sleeping creature. The bell hung motionless, suspended from a heavy beam, its surface dappled with shadows cast by the dancing leaves outside. It was large, but not enormous, elegant in its shape, its lip traced with a pattern too weathered to make out clearly. There was no rope attached to its tongue, no mechanism to ring it from below. It simply hung there, serene and waiting, like a heart that only beat when the world truly needed to listen. You sat beside it for a long while, legs curled beneath you on the sun-warmed boards, the breeze brushing gently against your skin and carrying with it the scent of lavender from the gardens below. Time moved differently in that space, not fast or slow, just softly, like honey trickling down the side of a spoon. Birds flitted from tree to tower to sky, their wings whispering secrets too old to understand. And somewhere in the distance, someone was playing a reed flute, the sound winding its way upward until it felt like part of the wind itself. That afternoon became one of those memories that does not fade but settles, instead, like a stone in a stream, steady and quiet beneath the current of everything else. You returned to the bell tower often after that, not for any reason, not with any question, but simply because something about that place felt like listening. And though you never heard the bell ring, not once, not even in your dreams, you always left with the sense that it had spoken to you all the same, in a language made not of sound, but of stillness. When the Feast of Lanterns came, the villagers would sometimes pass by the bell tower in procession, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies as they walked in slow reverence past the trees. Children would glance up at the boughs above and wonder aloud in whispers soft as candlelight, whether tonight would be the night. But the bell remained silent, as it always had, and the villagers would smile gently and move on, as if the silence itself was part of the celebration, part of the deep peace that the feast was meant to honor. And yet, as you remember it now, after the vanishing, after the disappearance of all that once was, you wonder. You wonder if perhaps it did ring once, not in a way anyone could hear, but in the way an old tree creaks before it falls, or in the way the air holds its breath just before snow begins to fall. You wonder if perhaps the bell called not to ears, but to hearts, or to memories, or to the bones of the earth itself. If perhaps it rang, and only the village knew how to listen. The tower still stands, you think, somewhere lost in the folds of forest and forgotten roads. It waits. The bell still hangs, rust softened by rain, shadowed by the same linden trees whose roots remember. And maybe, just maybe, the silence it keeps is not a silence of absence, but a silence of promise. That one day, when the wind turns just right, and someone places their hand on the worn stone and listens, truly listens, they'll hear not a sound, but a knowing, a message that was never meant for the ears, but for the hush that lives between each heartbeat. And if you dream of the bell, as you sometimes do, you dream not of sound, but of stillness, of standing there beneath the sky, of the breeze combing gently through your hair, of the way the world feels just before something sacred begins. And always, always, the bell remains still. And yet, there was a cottage at the farthest edge of the village, beyond the stone well and past the orchard, where the pear trees leaned toward each other like old friends in gentle conversation. It was the last dwelling before the bramble path gave way to the open meadows, where fog gathered low in the evenings and the grasses whispered in long, swaying sighs. The cottage itself was neither grand nor peculiar at first glance, low-roofed, with weathered shutters and creeping ivy that curled around the chimney like a sleeping serpent. But there was one thing about it that lingered in your mind like the scent of rain in summer, the window that glowed, even when no candle burned. It was the window that faced east, toward the rising sun, its panes warped with age and rimmed with lead that had darkened to the color of storm clouds. You remember walking by in the hush of evening, when the other cottages softened into shadows and only the lanterns swayed gently from their hooks, casting halos of gold upon the garden gates. And yet this window shone not brightly, not like a flame, but with a light so soft, so quiet, that it felt more like memory than fire, as if it were lit by the echo of something once held close. The villagers never spoke of it directly. They would nod as they passed, sometimes leaving a small bundle of herbs on the window sill, rose, ray lavender, sajor, laying a piece of honeycomb wrapped in linen upon the doorstep. It wasn't a place of fear, not exactly. It was more a place of deep and careful reverence, as one might feel upon entering a grove where something old and listening resides. You felt it, too, the first time you stood before that glowing window. Your breath caught slightly in your chest, not from dread, but from a hush so profound it seemed the air itself waited. They said a woman had once lived there, quiet figure, with eyes like soft embers and hair the color of hearth smoke. She came to the village long before your time, slipping in with the winter wind and leaving no footprints in the snow. She kept mostly to herself, tending her garden in silence, her fingers brushing the leaves with such tenderness it was as though she was listening through her skin. It was said she never aged, or if she did, it was in the way mountains do, slowly, solemnly, with dignity that does not ask to be noticed. No one ever saw her light a lamp, and yet the window glowed, even when the nights were thick with rain and the wind howled through the orchard. The glass would shimmer gently, as though the stars had found a way to nestle inside. And it was not just light that spilled from that place, but warmth, the kind that wrapped around your shoulders and pressed softly against the soles of your feet, the kind that made you want to hum an old tune without realizing why. You stood before it once in the deep hours between dusk and midnight, when the sky above the village was painted in long strokes of silver and plum, and the world held its breath between one thought and the next. The light in the window pulsed ever so faintly, like the slow rhythm of sleep, and you reached out tentatively, reverently letting your fingers hover just above the glass. It didn't feel like heat or cold, not like any temperature you could name, but something more subtle, like the weight of a kind gaze, or the echo of a lullaby, half remembered from childhood. Some believed the woman had woven light from threads of wind and silence, taught by the moon itself beneath a sky thick with stars. Others said she had no need for flame because she carried the dusk within her, and it spilled from her fingertips into the walls and windows of her home. Still others, those who whispered their beliefs only after 2 cups of cordial and in the company of swaying lanterns, said the window glowed because someone she had loved had never returned, and the light was the shape of her waiting. One evening, on the final feast before the village vanished, you found yourself drifting toward that cottage, drawn not by curiosity, but by the quiet tug of something gentle and invisible, like the pull of tide on the hem of your thoughts. You passed the orchard, where the pears hung heavy and sweet on the boughs, their scent rich and bruised in the twilight, and stepped through the bramble gate that squeaked like a voice trying not to speak. The door, as always, was shut. The chimney exhaled no smoke, and yet the window glowed, the same soft shimmer that had always been, painting the grass in threads of gold and shadow. That night, the villagers laid their lanterns at the base of the wall, dozens of them, flickering and still, as if they too wished to understand. No one knocked, no one spoke. It was not a night for questions. It was a night for presence, for stillness, for the soft and solemn recognition of something unknowable. You sat beside the others in the cool grass, your hands wrapped around a cup of elderflower cordial, the sweet tang lingering on your tongue, and listened not to sound, but to light itself, to the hush that poured from that window, as though it had waited all this time for the right ears to hear. And in that moment, you realized something you'd never put into words before, that the village itself was filled with places like this, quiet and unassuming, yet carrying within them a kind of soft magic, the kind that doesn't ask to be seen but waits patiently to be felt. The window never burned, it never blazed, it only glowed, the way moss glows after rain, the way the memory of kindness glows when the world has grown too cold. And perhaps that was enough. After the vanishing, when only stories remained, some said the light could still be seen if you stood in the meadow at dawn, just as the fog began to lift. Others said the cottage was never there at all, only the memory of it. But you know better. You remember the warmth that brushed your fingertips. You remember the hush that filled your lungs. And sometimes, when your dreams grow too quiet and you miss the softness of those long-ago nights, you close your eyes and see it again, the little window, glowing without flame, a promise that never needed to be spoken aloud. There was, in the heart of the village, a clock tower, so modest in height and shape that one might mistake it for the bell house of a chapel. Its stone worn smooth with centuries of soft wind and listening. It stood not to command attention, but to accompany the rhythm of the place, its chimes weaving through the seasons like a quiet breath, rising above the rooftops with the gentle certainty of waves brushing the shore. You remember how it would sound at dusk, just as the mist began to coil between the trees, a single tone that fell through the air like a pearl dropping into still water, never loud, never hurried, just a note that settled into the silence like it belonged there. Its face was round and pale, the numerals hand-painted in a script that curled like vines, now faded to the faintest charcoal. The minute hand always moved, as if remembering the way, never stiff or ticking, but gliding slowly, patiently, as though it trusted you to never rush. There was moss at the base of the tower, a green that deepened after rain, and swallows often nested in the corners beneath the copper roof, their calls threading in between the soft pulse of the bells. In spring, the tower would warm beneath the morning light, casting elongated shadows across the cobbled square where the elder vendors sold sugared almonds and thyme-scented bread. In winter, it seemed to hibernate, the chime muffled by snow, as though even time itself had curled up in sleep beneath a woolen blanket. You recall how the villagers would pause, ever so slightly, whenever it rang, just a tilt of the head, a quiet glance skyward, hands stilling in dough or broomwork or embroidery. It was not a clock that demanded anything of you. It did not dictate or divide. It merely reminded, gently, like a whisper across your shoulder, that the moment you were in was passing, and that was all right. Children would play at its base in the golden hours, kicking pine cones and laughing softly, their voices never too loud, as if even they knew to speak in harmony with the air. But there came a time, though no one marked it with ceremony or alarm, when the clock simply ceased to chime. It happened not with a gasp or a jolt, but with a kind of quiet agreement between the tower and the sky. One evening, as the lanterns were being lit and the scent of cinnamon and smoke drifted from open windows, the bell did not toll, and though you waited, as did others, looking toward the pale face of the clock, as if it might clear its throat and begin again, nothing came, only silence, soft and undisturbed, folding around the tower like the hem of twilight. What was strange, though, was not its stillness, but the way the village seemed to drift so easily into its absence, as though the chime had done its work and was now resting. The people still moved in rhythm, still lit their lamps and boiled their stews and walked home beneath the same tender stars, but something had shifted beneath the skin of things. The hush grew deeper. The wind through the branches lingered a little longer. Even the cats that wound around garden gates seemed to tread more quietly. It was as if the whole village had leaned into that silence and found it comforting. You remember going up the narrow spiral stairs inside the tower once, long ago, when you were still small enough to carry a sense of awe without effort. The stone steps were worn into shallow curves by countless feet and smelled of lichen and thyme. A window near the top looked out over the thatched roofs and hedgerows, and beyond, the fields that ran toward the hills like a patchwork of dreams. At the summit, the bell itself hung motionless, a graceful arc of bronze that caught the light like an old memory, dulled and lovely. You had reached out then, placing your palm against its side, and it had been warm, as though it remembered being rung. You did not dare to sound it. You only stood there in the dusty quiet, feeling the hum of the village below through the soles of your shoes. They say the bell stopped because the Feast of Lanterns was near, and perhaps the village had already begun to slip into that other place. The place where echoes last longer and time itself forgets to press forward. Or perhaps it was an offering one last quiet gift before the world turned. Its face and the village passed from the map of what is known. Some said the clock was tired. Others said it was listening. And still others, the oldest ones with voices like soft parchment, believed that the bell had rung its final note, not outward, but inward, calling something home. And even now, when you close your eyes and listen not with your ears, but with the deeper part of you that still remembers how morning smelled in that place, you can hear it faintly, not as a sound, but as a space where sound used to be. The clock that forgot to chime did not forget out of error. It forgot with intention, with the same tender forgetfulness that lets petals fall or snow dissolve on warm stone. It simply chose to let go, to become still, as the village around it prepared to do the same. You carry that silence with you now, tucked inside the folds of your sleep like a silken thread. It hums in the background of your quietest moments, the hush before the kettle sings, the pause before a word is spoken, the stillness between heartbeats when you stand before the window in the early dawn and wait for the light to find you. And though the clock no longer counts the hours, it holds something else now, something more enduring than time. The memory of what it means to be exactly where you are, in the breath between what was and what will be, glowing softly like a lantern in the dark. There was a small cottage on the quietest bend of the village lane, where the path narrowed. It sat low against the earth, its roof bowed gently with age, like a head that had nodded so often in listening that it had forgotten how to lift again. You would pass it sometimes, without even realizing, for ivy curled thick around its stone, and the honeysuckle along the eaves bloomed so sweetly in spring that it distracted the eye. But once, perhaps more than once, you lingered outside its window, drawn not by any sound or voice, but by the movement of soft threads, catching the last of the sunlight, like strands of golden rain. She lived there, the weaver, and, though few knew her name, everyone knew the window. It faced east, toward the rising sun, and the quiet edge of the fields where the mists liked to sleep in the hollows. Each morning, that window would be open, just slightly, enough for the scent of warm wool and herbal tea to drift out into the lane. You remember how it felt to pass by in early dawn, your breath still clouded from sleep, and see her silhouette bent over the loom, her hands moving in a rhythm older than song. She never looked up, but you always felt she knew you were there. Inside, the room was dim and golden, always golden, even in rain or dusk or winter's grayest hours. The light there seemed to linger longer, soaking into the wood of the beams and the folds of the curtains, as if the cottage held a private sun within it. The loom stood beneath the window like an altar, and beside it, jars of dyed yarn stood in soft roseplum and saffron, sage and rust, pearl and storm gray. Sometimes you'd hear the creak of the foot pedal as you walked past, a slow and soothing sound, like the breathing of the house itself. And if the breeze was right, you might catch the faint tap of the shuttle, the sigh of thread drawn across thread, the rustle of fabric becoming. The weaver never spoke much, and yet the village trusted her, in the way you trust something that has always been quietly there, when someone married or crossed into elderhood or returned from a journey changed, it was said that she would weave something for them not to give, but simply to mark the moment. You never saw her deliver these things, and yet they always arrived. A shawl left on a doorstep, a ribbon tied to a gate, a blanket folded beside a newborn's cradle. Her work never carried her name, only a small stitched symbol in one corner, a closed eye, embroidered in fine silver thread. She wove the seasons too, or so it was believed. Each solstice, a new tapestry would appear in the window, unannounced, draped gently over the sill like a blessing. They were never the same. One year it was filled with stars, not in constellations, but scattered like they had just fallen from the sky and landed, twinkling, into the threads. Another year it was the forest in frost, every tree rendered in fine, glistening white, so detailed that even the deer tracks could be seen beneath the silver pines. And one year your favorite it was the village itself, not as it was, but as it felt. The curved rooftops, the trailing smoke, the crooked fences softened by ivy and light, all rendered in shades of dusk, as if twilight had been captured and woven into wool. You visited her once, though you can't quite say how or why. Perhaps the path turned differently that day, or perhaps you were dreaming. The door opened before you knocked, and inside it smelled of sage and lavender and something faintly metallic, like rain on old thread. She led you in without a word, her fingers dusted with fine flecks of fiber. You sat by the hearth while she poured warm cider into a chipped cup and gave you a square of soft cloth, dyed the color of fading rose petals. "Hold this," she said, her voice like linen folding. "It remembers warmth," and it did. Even now, you can feel it, how the cloth held the heat of her hands long after the fire had gone out. The weaver, they said, never aged. Her hair silvered, but her face did not change. Her hands, though lined and strong, moved with the grace of rivers and vines. Some believed she was older than the village itself, that she had come before the first stones were laid and would remain after the last lantern was dimmed. Others whispered that she did not weave from thread alone, but from time, stitching moments together to keep the village whole. There was no fear in these stories, only reverence, a sense that she was part of something deeper, something the rest of the world had long forgotten how to hold. And when the Feast of Lanterns came that final time, her window was the last to darken. Long after the final lantern had floated beyond the trees and the bells had fallen quiet, her loom still sounded through the night, weaving something none would ever see again. Some say she was preparing the village itself, threading it gently into the fabric of another world, one where clocks do not chime and roads do not lead back, but forward, softly, endlessly, into memory. Now, when you close your eyes, you sometimes find yourself standing again outside that window. The hedgerows are in bloom, the mist is rising, and there, behind the glass, her hands still move slow, steady, sure as if the loom was never abandoned, only turned slightly, so that it now weaves dreams instead of cloth. You listen to the hush of thread against thread, the whisper of the shuttle's journey, and you remember every village, every home, every heart needs someone to weave its story together. Quietly, patiently, one golden thread at a time. There was a place beneath the village square that most had walked over hundreds of times without knowing. Just a slab of stone tucked behind the bakery, uneven and cool to the touch, its edges worn soft by the passage of boots and the rhythm of cartwheels. but you knew it was there. You always did, and you always paused, even if only for a breath, to glance toward it when the morning was quiet and the light had just begun to settle like honey between the cracks of the cobblestones. Beneath that stone was a stairwell that spiraled gently down into the Candlekeeper's cellar. And that cellar, more than anything else, felt like the heartbeat of the village. The Candlekeeper was not a man or a woman, not young or old, but simply there, as enduring and quiet as the bees that worked tirelessly in the hives beyond the edge of the orchard. No one could remember the first time they saw the keeper, but everyone remembered their sentimix of tallow and honeycomb, smoke and lavender, like something comforting wrapped in something ancient. You remember stepping through the door at the bottom of the stairs, where the coolness of the earth met the golden breath of 1,000 flickering flames. It was not cold, not truly, but the kind of cool that made your skin sing, that wrapped around you like a silk shawl pulled from the deep shade of a summer tree. The cellar walls were rounded and smooth, carved from stone that held the scent of time itself. There were no windows, and yet the light danced everywhere, warm and liquid, spilling from shelves upon shelves of candles in every shape and size. Tall ones, the color of cream, short ones, like polished amber, twisted ones, like vines wrapped in moonlight. Some sat in pewter bowls, others in cracked teacups or rough clay dishes that still bore the maker's thumbprint. Their flames never seemed hurried, never fought the air or sputtered in fear. They just glowed, gently, as if whispering stories to one another in a language only wax could speak. The Candlekeeper never rushed. They moved slowly, with hands that remembered every wick and every pool of hardened wax. You watched as they trimmed each candle's edge with a small silver blade, then dipped new ones into warm, perfumed vats that sent up soft curls of steam, scented with rosemary and rosewood, beeswax and bergamot. The air down there was thick with warmth and memory, the scent of it clinging to your clothes long after you'd returned to the daylight. It was said that no two candles were ever exactly alike, because no two moments ever were. That's what the keeper believed, that each candle held not just light, but time, and that the way a flame flickered could speak of joy, of sorrow, of silence remembered or laughter forgotten. On the night of the Feast of Lanterns, the Candlekeeper always emerged just before dusk, carrying a tray of small votives, each one lit, each one different, each one meant for a hand that needed it. You remember standing among the others in the square, your breath soft in the cooling air, your palms outstretched to receive the glow. The keeper would nod gently, their eyes full of kindness and knowing, and the moment the candle was placed into your hand, it was as if the whole world hushed. No music played, and yet your heartbeat moved in rhythm with the light, and the warmth of the flame seeped into your chest like something being stitched back together. There was always one candle that remained unclaimed. The keeper would place it at the base of the old stone tree in the center of the square, letting it burn down slowly into the night. No one ever touched it, but everyone watched it. The way it flickered slightly to the side, as if the wind of another world tugged at its edge. And when it finally went out, just before dawn, the last of the stars would blink away and the village would breathe again, softened and new. You think of that final night often, how the keeper descended into the cellar one last time, the edge of their robe brushing the stone steps like falling ash. No one saw them afterward, but there were rumors of light seen beneath the square even after the village vanished, of warmth in the stones even on the coldest mornings. Some said the cellar remained, not lost, but tucked away, hidden in folds of time like a pressed flower in a forgotten book. Others said the keeper had lit one final candle, taller and brighter than all the rest, and that its flame burned not with fire, but with memory itself. Sometimes, when you dream, you find yourself in that cellar again. The air is warm, but not heavy. The light is soft, but never dim. You hear the gentle crackle of wax melting, the distant hum of bees in some far-off orchard, and the soft breath of someone nearby. Watching the flame the way you watch clouds or the tide without, needing to understand, only to feel. You walk past the rows of shelves, your fingers brushing glass and clay, your heart quiet and full, and then you see it, a candle with your name etched into the wax, though you never told it to anyone. You reach for it, your hand steady, and in the moment you lift it, the flame flutters, as if in recognition of you, of this, of all the light you've carried and forgotten you were carrying. And even when you wake, the scent of warm beeswax still lingers on your skin, and you walk a little slower, as though some small flame still flickers quietly in your chest, lighting the way back to somewhere you almost remember. There was a house at the very edge of the village, just past the moss-covered boundary stones, where the trees began to lean in close, and the path narrowed into something more whispered than walked. It was a place where few ventured, unless they had something to say without speaking, a thought too fragile for voice, but too heavy to keep. That was where the ink-maker lived, not in solitude, but in stillness, and the stillness itself was welcoming, like the pause before snowfall or the breath before a lullaby. You remember the house for its scent more than its shape, the way the air inside always smelled of cedar shavings, pressed violets, warm dust, and the faint iron temps of fresh ink soaking into parchment. The windows were small and fogged with time, yet golden light always found its way in, folding across the wooden floor in wide, soft strokes like the brush of a painter, unsure whether to finish or begin. Inside, shelves bent slightly under the weight of old tomes and curled scrolls, their spines faded and their pages edged with gold dust and use. Bottles of ink lined the walls, some tall and thin like icicles, others squat and round like river stones, each labeled in a hand so delicate it seemed to float above the paper. You could never guess what color might bloom from each bottle, because the labels told no names, only feelings, remembrance, winter's grace, the sound of morning rain, a thought not yet spoken. You remember the ink-maker's table, most of all a broad, uneven slab of maple wood stained, dark with years of stories and poems, and half-written lullabies. Its surface bore the marks of years, of knives and quills, of elbows leaned in long contemplation. There was always a pot of tea steeping nearby, fragrant with cinnamon or lemongrass, or whatever the ink-maker had gathered from the hedgerows that morning, and a small, crackling hearth that filled the room with the soft pop of drying pine cones and the occasional hiss of sap. When you entered, the ink-maker never looked up right away, for they always finished the line they were writing before speaking, as if words had their own rhythm, and it would be unkind to interrupt. You never needed to explain why you came. The ink-maker always seemed to know, simply sliding a clean sheet of paper toward you, smoothing it with care, and handing you a pen weighted just enough to make your thoughts slow down. You'd sit, breathing in the warmth and the quiet, and begin to write not a letter, not a story, but something softer, something shaped more by feeling than structure. You might write a memory of someone's voice, or the way the rain felt that one evening by the river, or how a certain silence in the orchard made your heart feel like a feather sinking into syrup. And when you were done, the inkmaker would take the page, nod once with that serene kind of understanding, and slide it gently into a folded envelope of pale blue or dove gray or deep green, as though tucking it into the folds of time itself. No one ever asked what happened to those pages. They were not mailed, not sealed with wax, or delivered by hand. Some said the inkmaker burned them at dusk, whispering their words into the flames, where they could rise like moths and disappear into the stars. Others believed they were buried beneath the roots of the old tree near the chapel, wrapped in muslin and placed where the earth would hold them close. But a few believed, and perhaps you did too, that the ink did not stay on paper at all, that the moment the words were written, they became part of the village itself, embedded in the stone and soil, in the wind that passed through the eaves and the shadows that lingered just a breath longer in the corners of each room. On the night of the Feast of Lanterns, the inkmaker's door was always left ajar, the scent of clove and ink drifting out onto the path like a beckoning sigh. The lanterns in their window glowed the softest of blues, and on a small wooden pedestal just outside the doorway sat a stack of folded papers, one for each villager. You remember walking slowly through the misty evening, the light of your own lantern catching the shimmer of the inkmaker's envelopes like moonlight on a quiet lake. Your name was written in the same delicate hand, and as you unfolded the page, the words inside did not surprise you. They felt as though they had always lived inside you, only waiting to be drawn out, to be seen in ink. Some wept upon reading theirs, though not from sorrow. Some smiled in that quiet way that means understanding has passed between two things too deep for speech. And some, like you, simply stood still for a long time, letting the candlelight soften the edges of the letters and allowing the stillness to press gently into your bones. For one evening a year, every person in the village knew without question that their feelings were real, and that they had been witnessed, even if only in the silence between the inkmaker's words. After the village vanished, long after the stone paths were claimed by moss and the wells ran dry, travelers sometimes spoke of finding letters tucked beneath the bark of trees or folded into cracks in old walls, pages filled with words that spoke directly to the heart, written in a hand so fine it could only be wind or memory. You sometimes wonder if the inkmaker still writes somewhere, beneath roots or between stars, their table lit by the soft fire of forgotten thoughts, and their fingers stained forever with truth. And now, as you lie in the hush of the evening, you can almost smell the ink again, earthy and warm, with just a touch of something floral. You imagine a sheet of paper sliding toward you once more, blank and waiting, the pen cool in your hand, the flicker of firelight nearby. You don't need to think too hard. The words will come, soft as breath, shaped by everything you've ever wished to say. And when they do, you will know they were always meant to be written. You remember the orchard most vividly, not just as a place, but as a feeling that settled softly on your skin and breathed low beneath your feet. In spring, the blossoms spilled over like clouds of pale pink and white, petals drifting on the breeze like whispered secrets. And in autumn, the air was thick with the scent of ripe apples, crisp and sharp, and pears that held the sweet weight of late light. The orchard was a place of slow magic, where time seemed to stretch and fold back on itself, where you could lose the sharp edges of the day and find only softness. The leaves rustled gently above, a quiet song in the hush of the afternoon, and the light filtered through in shifting patterns, warm and dappled like liquid gold. Sometimes, if the wind was just right, you could hear something more than the simple murmur of branches, a low hum, like a breath held and released, a voice almost too faint to catch. It was not frightening or strange, but comforting, as if the orchard itself was speaking directly to you, telling stories not with words, but with the softness of shade and the weight of fruit. In those moments, you felt the world slow to a rhythm just beneath your own heartbeat, a pulse as steady as the fall of leaves in winter or the return of dawn. You remember the way the sun felt on your face, gentle and warm, the way the air tasted faintly of earth and sweetness, and how the shadows played softly on your skin like a whispered caress. You remember the heavy stillness in the spaces between the trees, the way the silence was full, not empty, a silence that held memory and promise and all the things that words cannot quite capture. The villagers believed the orchard was alive in a way that was older than anything else, a place where time itself could pause, and where the boundaries between then and now blurred like watercolor running on paper. They said the trees remembered everything, the laughter of children who played beneath their boughs, the quiet prayers whispered under starlit skies, the soft sighs of lovers meeting in secret. The fruit carried the sweetness of all those moments, each bite a tasting of time folded gently into the flesh. And sometimes, on evenings when the mist drifted low and the lanterns glowed faintly behind the hedgerows, the orchard would seem to breathe, the leaves rustling in a language you felt more than heard. There was a particular tree you favored, a gnarled old apple, its branches heavy and low, its bark worn smooth from years of reaching toward the sky. In those quiet moments, the orchard's hum would swell just enough to fill the spaces inside you that needed it most, softening the edges of worry, warming the hollow places, and weaving a thread of peace through your thoughts. On the night of the Feast of Lanterns, the orchard was a place of gentle magic. Lanterns hung from every branch, glowing softly like stars caught among the leaves. You remember the hush that fell over the village as people wandered beneath the glowing trees, their footsteps light and voices low, their hearts touched by the simple grace of that shared light. The air was thick with the sweetness of apples and honey, with the warmth of woolen cloaks and the soft brush of fingers reaching out to catch a drifting petal. Or, that night, you felt the orchard hold you close, a living cradle of light and shadow and memory, as if it knew this moment would be one of the last before the village slipped quietly beyond reach. And though you did not speak aloud, the orchard seemed to answer you, its rustling leaves, a promise carried on the wind, a reminder that even when the world changes, even when the lanterns fade, the quiet magic of belonging lingers still. In the years that followed, after the village vanished and only stories remained, travelers spoke of an orchard hidden beyond the hills where the trees glowed faintly with lantern light, where the air smelled of honey and earth, and where the silence was full and soft, like a lullaby waiting to be heard. You close your eyes and find yourself there, again barefoot, among the apples, the cool grass brushing your ankles, the soft light wrapping around you like a whispered blessing, and the orchard humming quietly, a song that never truly ends. You know the well, don't you? the one that sits quietly in the heart of the village square, encircled by worn stones and patches of moss that curl like whispered secrets. It's not a grand well, with towering walls or carved reliefs, but simple and steady, as if it has been waiting, always waiting, to catch the quiet passage of days. When you stand beside it, the air feels cooler, touched by the deep, slow breath of the earth beneath your feet, as if the well holds not just water, but the weight of many moments, folded softly into the dark. You remember leaning over its edge once, peering down into the velvet shadow where the water pools still and deep. The surface was like glass, so perfect it caught the waning light and mirrored the sky above, slow swirl of stars just beginning to shimmer, pale as the first breath of dawn. When you dropped a pebble into the well, the sound was soft and hollow, the ripples spreading out in circles that seemed to fold back into themselves, vanishing before they could touch the edges. It was a sound that belonged to no one and everyone, like the hush between words, or the pause in a song where the heart listens most closely. The well was always there, watching and waiting, a silent guardian of all the whispers and wishes that the village held but never spoke aloud. Children sometimes dropped flowers into its depths, petals floating like tiny lanterns on the still water, while elders would press their palms against the cool stone, eyes closed, as if drawing peace from the steady pulse beneath. And you remember the way the air smelled there, fresh and earthy, with just a hint of moss and something older, like the scent of roots curling deep into the dark, thirsty soil. There was a quiet magic to the well, a magic not of loud wonders or blazing light, but of presence, a calm that seeped through the stones and into your bones, softening the sharp edges of worry and fear. On the night of the Feast of Lanterns, the well was the first place many came, carrying candles and small offerings wrapped in cloth, their steps slow and reverent. You stood there too, holding your own lantern, its flame dancing gently in the cool air, watching the reflections shift and shimmer with each breath of wind. Around you, the village gathered, their faces softened by the glow, and for a moment, the world felt bound together by the quiet, steady heart of that well. But that year, the well grew silent in a way you had never known before. The water, once full and deep, seemed to hold less in its depths, the surface flat and unyielding as a sleeping stone. No ripples came when stones fell, no soft murmurs rose from below. It was as if the well had turned inward, holding its breath, waiting for something no one could name. And though the villagers tried to fill it with offerings, with prayers and hope, the stillness remained, and the coolness around it deepened, wrapping the square in a veil of quiet mystery. You wonder if the well sensed what was to come, if it knew the village's story was folding in on itself, like the petals of a night-blooming flower closing, not with sorrow, but with the soft inevitability of dusk. The well's silence was not emptiness, but a kind of fullness, a resting place for all that had been whispered and dreamed and held in the spaces between heartbeats. It became a mirror, reflecting not just the sky, but the unseen threads that tied the village together. The unseen currents of memory, belonging, and the gentle fading of time. Long after the village vanished, travelers spoke of finding wells in places forgotten by maps. Wells that held still waters like deep pools of light. They said that if you stood quietly beside one, you could hear your own breath in the silence, and maybe, just maybe, hear the faint echo of a village that once was a village, cradled by stone and shadow, held safe in the deep, steady heart of a silent well. And now, as you settle beneath your own soft blankets, the memory of that well rests with you, cool and calm, like a whispered promise. You carry its quiet with youth feeling of water, held gently in darkness. The stillness that is never quite empty, and the knowledge that some things, no matter how far they vanish, remain waiting beneath the surface, ready to hold you close whenever you listen with your heart. There stood, just beyond the cluster of rooftops and twisting lanes, the village's old bell tower, rising quietly against the sky like a guardian who had long since forgotten to shout. It was not a grand structure, no carved stone lions or towering spires, but rather a simple wooden frame wrapped in weathered shingles, bowed slightly with age and crowned by a bell whose surface was mottled and worn from years of wind and rain. You remember how the tower caught the light in a soft, muted way, like the hush after twilight, when shadows gather gently and the last amber glow lingers like a whispered farewell. The bell tower was the village's heartbeat, though it never beat loud or fast. Its voice was calm and deep, a low toll that rose slowly and drifted over the fields like a slow, steady breath. You would often find yourself standing beneath its shadow in the cool morning hours, the scent of damp wood and pine sap filling the air. The soft rustle of leaves overhead blending with the distant call of birds waking to the day. When the bell sounded, its voice carried no rush or urgency, only the gentle unfolding of time, a reminder of the day's passage and the quiet gathering of lives in a shared rhythm. You recall the first time you climbed the narrow steps within the tower. There would worn smooth by countless footsteps, the walls close enough to feel like a cradle holding you as you ascended. The air inside was cool and still, touched faintly by the scent of smoke and old rope, and the light fell in narrow slivers through small windows, painting soft beams of gold and gray on the rough-hewn floor. When you reached the top, you stood beside the bell, your hand brushing the cold metal that had rung through every season, every sunrise and sunset, every moment both ordinary and sacred. The view stretched wide fields blending into forests, the village rooftops clustered like scattered stones, the sky vast and endless above, a quiet blue whispering promises of calm and eternity. On the night of the Feast of Lanterns, the bell tower held a special kind of stillness. The lanterns would be hung from the rafters and swayed gently in the soft breath of the evening air, their warm light flickering like fireflies caught in glass. You remember the way the glow pooled beneath the beams, golden and serene as villagers gathered below, their faces softened by light and shadow, their voices lowered into song and story. When the bell finally tolled at the feast's end, its sound rose slowly, carrying a gentle farewell, a blessing cast wide and deep, as if inviting all who listened to carry the night softly in their hearts. That year the village vanished, the bell tolled one final time, but instead of echoing far across fields and forest, the sound lingered close, folding into the still air like a breath held in quiet reverence. The lanterns in the tower's windows flickered and dimmed, and the village fell into a silence that was not empty, but full like a soft pause that stretched beyond the moment, a quiet pause in the fabric of time itself. You remember standing beneath the tower that night, feeling the cool air settle around you, smelling the faint trace of smoke from distant hearths, hearing nothing but the slow whisper of wind through the trees. Now, long after the village slipped quietly beyond sight, travelers tell tales of a bell that rings not with sound, but with memory felt deep inside the chest, like the steady pulse of a heartbeat. They speak of light in the tower windows, a soft glow that appears on the darkest nights, guiding lost wanderers home, even when there is no road to follow. And sometimes, if you close your eyes just so, you can still hear the bell's gentle call, a reminder that even in absence, some things endure, held steady by the quiet strength of remembering. As you settle into the hush of your own night, the old bell tower lingers with you, a place where time slows and light softens, where the sound of a bell is not just heard but felt, echoing gently through your dreams like a tender promise, whispering that no matter where you are always carried home. There was a small cottage near the river's bend, where the soft murmur of water met the gentle rustle of reeds, and the air carried the cool, fresh scent of flowing currents mingled with wildflowers. You remember this place not only for the quiet beauty of the land, but for the slow, steady rhythm that lived within its walls, the rhythm of the weaver's loom, a timeless dance of thread and hand, of patience and grace. The cottage always smelled faintly of flax and lavender, a scent that wrapped around you like a delicate shawl, soft and comforting, and that lingered on your skin long after you had stepped away from the door. Inside, the loom stood as a silent sentinel, its wooden frame polished smooth by countless years of use, its threads stretched taut like fragile bridges waiting to be crossed. The weaver worked without hurry, her fingers moving with the gentle certainty of a slow river carving stone, weaving patterns that told stories too soft for spoken words, stories of seasons turning, of rivers flowing, of sunlight spilling through leaves in quiet bursts. You could feel the history spun into each thread, the careful weaving of light and shadow, hope and memory, stitched into fabrics that seemed to hold the weight of the sky itself. You recall sitting near the window, watching the golden afternoon light pour in, dust motes drifting lazily like tiny dancers caught in a sunbeam. As the shuttle passed through the threads with a rhythmic whisper, the sound was like a heartbeat, steady and sure, filling the room with a sense of peace that wrapped itself gently around your thoughts. The fabric that emerged was more than cloth, it was a map of the village's soul, woven in colors soft as twilight, patterns that traced the curve of the hills and the pulse of the seasons, the very breath of the land made visible. On the eve of the Feast of Lanterns, the weaver would finish her work just as the village began to glow with the gentle flicker of lanterns hung along every street and branch. She would wrap a piece of cloth woven that very day in her hands, warm from the hearth, and carry it to the square. The fabric, light and shimmering with threads of silver and gold, was laid gently at the base of the ancient tree, a silent gift to the night, a tender offering woven from the hours and hopes of many days. It was said that this cloth carried the prayers of the village, soft as whispered wishes, and that to touch it was to feel the heartbeat of a community bound by light and time. That year, when the village vanished, the weaver's loom sat quiet, its threads still but taut, waiting for hands that never came again. Yet some say that if you stand by the river's bend on a still evening, when the sky is a deep wash of indigo and the stars begin to blink awake, you might catch the faintest sound of shuttle and thread, a soft murmur like the weaving of dreams, a tender song spun from moonlight and memory. It is a sound not meant for ears alone, but for hearts that remember how to listen to silence and light. You carry the image of that loom with you, its quiet strength and slow rhythm, a balm in the stillness. As you lie beneath your own soft covers, the memory of weaving drapes around you like a silken thread, pulling you gently into sleep. You imagine the fabric growing beneath your fingertips, soft and warm, patterned with all the light you've ever seen, and the quiet love that lives in the spaces between moments. And in that quiet, woven world, you find yourself cradled in the gentle pulse of time, held safe in the steady rhythm of a weaver's hands, beneath the soft glow of a vanished village's last lanterns. There is a quiet corner in the heart of the village, a small stone cottage where the hearth always burned low and warm, cradling the soft glow of embers like a secret kept close to the skin. You remember this place not by the bustle of life, but by the gentle stillness that settled there, the kind of stillness that feels like a soft sigh, a lull in the world's breath where time folds in on itself, and all that remains is the tender warmth of memory. The scent of burning wood lingered in the air, mingled with the faint, sweet hint of dried herbs, sage, thyme, and lavender, woven into bundles that hung by the rafters, their shadows dancing quietly in the flickering firelight. You remember the texture of the rough stone hearth beneath your fingers, cool now, but holding the memory of heat, a warmth that spread slowly like a soft caress, filling the room with a gentle pulse. The fire itself was never roaring, but steady, a constant companion in the dim hours, glowing with a soft amber light that spilled across the walls in lazy waves, casting long, tender shadows that seemed to hold stories in their curves and folds. You might have sat there for hours, watching the last ember flicker and glow, feeling the weight of quiet that settled like a blanket around your shoulders, heavy with all the things left unsaid. The hearth was the soul of the cottage, and the cottage was the heart of the village. It was where meals were shared, where hands were warmed, where the soft murmur of voices wove together like threads in a tapestry. On the evening of the Feast of Lanterns, the hearth glowed brighter, as if it knew the night was meant to hold something special, something sacred. The villagers gathered close, faces flushed from the cool air outside, eyes reflecting the fire's gentle dance. They spoke in low tones, their words blending with the crackle of flames and the whisper of wind beyond the windows. Their laughter soft and warm like the flame's own light. That night you held a cup of spiced cider, its steam curling around your face, sweet and sharp with cinnamon and cloves, the warmth seeping slowly into your palms. The fire's glow made the walls shimmer softly, and you felt the village's quiet heartbeats, steady and sure, beneath the hushed songs and the soft steps of feet on worn floorboards. The air was filled with the scent of burning pine and the faint trace of smoke from the lanterns hung just outside, mingling with the sweetness of honeyed cakes and the delicate spice of fresh bread. As the feast waned, the fire's light softened, embers falling to a glowing bed that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. You leaned closer, feeling the warmth touch your skin, the faint heat pressing gently, like a memory, familiar and soothing. The night outside grew darker, the lantern's light thinning to fragile flickers, and the village seemed to hold its breath, wrapped in the gentle quiet of the hearth's last ember. And then, as dawn began to pale the edges of night, the hearth's glow faded to a soft gray ash, still warm but fading like a whispered goodbye. You remember that moment, the fragile hush that followed, the way the world seemed to hold itself still, as if waiting for something beyond sight and sound. The village vanished soon after, slipping quietly beyond the reach of morning light. But the memory of that hearth's warmth stayed with you, a soft ember glowing deep inside, a promise of comfort and belonging carried through all the years to come. Now, as you rest beneath your blankets, the memory of that hearth lingers like a gentle glow beneath your skin. You feel its warmth steadying you, a soft pulse in the quiet dark, carrying you slowly toward sleep. The scent of pine and spice drifts through your thoughts, and the last ember's glow cradles you like a lullaby, whispering that no matter where you wander, the gentle warmth of home remains, waiting quietly beneath the stars. There is a place you carry quietly inside your mind, where the last lanterns of the feast once hung, swaying gently in the breath of evening air, their soft flames weaving golden threads through the dark like fragile promises whispered to the night. You remember that twilight moment, the world wrapped in a gentle hush, the scent of burning wax mingling with the coolness of dew settling softly on the leaves, and the lantern's light spilling in pools of amber warmth, soft as a lullaby, cradling a weary heart. The village seemed to breathe then, slow and steady, as if caught between a sigh and a dream, holding on to the delicate glow that marked the turning of the year and the weaving of stories old as time. You stood among the lanterns, your fingers tracing the smooth glass as if to capture their warmth, your breath a quiet mist in the cool air mingling with the soft flicker of flame. The light wrapped around you like a gentle shawl, touching your skin with the tender pulse of hope and remembrance. Around you, the village held its quiet vigil, faces softened by the glow, eyes reflecting stories told not in words but in the gentle dance of shadows and light. The scent of pine and honeyed cakes floated faintly, mingling with the soft rustle of lantern paper, fragile and beautiful, trembling in the slow night breeze. That night, the lanterns held a magic deeper than mere light, a magic of connection, of memory and belonging, woven through every flicker and glow. They carried the wishes of those who lit them, small hopes that rose like whispered prayers, floating upward to the stars and weaving between the leaves of ancient trees. You remember how the light seemed to listen, gathering the quiet dreams of children and elders alike, wrapping them in warmth to carry safely through the cold and dark. It was a light that spoke of home, of gentle presence, and of the soft promise that even when all else fades, some glow remains steady and true. When the village vanished after that feast, the lantern's last light lingered in the memory of the land, a soft echo in the hush between days. Travelers say that on the quietest nights, when the moon hangs low and the air is still, you might glimpse faint flickers drifting through the trees' lanterns, not made of paper or flame, but of something older, something woven from the breath of the earth itself. They say these lights move slowly, like fireflies caught in a dream, guiding lost souls and weary travelers back to a place that exists not on any map, but deep within the heart's quietest corners. And now, as you close your eyes, the lantern's last light settles softly, with you a gentle warmth cradling your thoughts, a quiet pulse beneath the breath of night. You feel the glow wrap around you, a tender touch as soft as moonlight on skin, carrying you gently toward sleep. The scent of wax and pine drifts through your dreams, and the soft flicker of those vanished lights guides you through the quiet dark, reminding you that no matter how far the village may have slipped beyond the reach of time and sight, Its gentle heart still beats within the tender glow of a lantern's last light, forever kindling the warmth of belonging deep inside you. Thank you for wandering through this forgotten village with me tonight, where light and memory intertwine like the soft dance of lantern flames. May the quiet warmth of these stories stay with you as you drift into peaceful dreams. Until next time, sleep gently, and may your heart always find its way home.